Hi, I'm Stephanie Boluk,
And I'm Patrick LeMieux.
and today we're going to talk about recreating games, and specifically The Legend of Zelda as a method for doing game history, game pedagogy, and game art.
In 1999, Rhonda Roland Shear and Stephen Jay Gould spent a day dropping pieces of string in their apartment. At the time, they were editors of Tout Fait, the Marcel Duchamp Studies online journal, owners of the largest private collection of Duchamp's work, and were trying to recreate 3 standard stoppages. The beloved pataphysical project had a clear set of instructions outlined in Duchamp's box of 1914. Drop 3 1-meter threads from 1 meter high, then fix them in place to produce an alternative measurement system for the 20th century. Shear and Gould tried to copy this method, but no matter which thread they used or how they dropped it, nothing came remotely close to Duchamp's smooth sinusoidals. Shear remembers, "We tried to replicate Duchamp's smooth and gentle patterns by hundreds of frustrating drops, using all kinds of threads, including different materials of cotton, silk, and wool, different weights, different waxed and unwaxed surfaces, and even regular tailor's thread that would have been available in France during 1913. We never came close to replicating the smooth patterns of the stoppages." So Shear called conservators Erica Mosher, Pat Houlihan, and Christopher McGlinchey at the MoMA and asked them to check it out. When the conservators peeked at the back of each board, they realized almost immediately that the threads were not dropped, but sewn in place. Somehow, in 85 years of studying, writing, and looking at Duchamp's work, nobody had ever thought to check for evidence that he'd actually dropped them. With their attempt to recreate 3 standard stoppages, Shear and Gould had, quote, "solved the old problem with almost embarrassing simplicity, in a simple and direct way that any even casually suspicious scholar could have discovered at any time." And although this discovery is less a critique and more of a playful complexification of the ideas about chance and science within Duchamp's work, it does reveal a gap in certain art historical methods. What artists say is not always what you get, and simply trying to redo, remake, or recreate an artwork would often reveal more about it than you would expect, or at least more than what you would find in interviews, didactics, catalogs, and art histories.
Shear's attempt to remake Duchamp's work looks a little like Borges' short story about Pierre Menard. In Pierre Menard, author of Quixote, the eponymous author succeeds in recreating Cervantes' novel line by line, but, despite the absurd thoroughness of his process, ends up making a different experience altogether. It turns out that not only is the map not the territory, but the territory isn't the territory. Borges' parable about the impossibility of historical repetition articulates the individuality of matter, the irreducibility of embodied experience, and a potential method for making art. So we could define Menardism as a naive attempt at perfect recreation that must fail, but in doing so, in failing, marks historical difference. So what can we learn through this Menardist approach to media archaeology, media art, or game design? What if instead of a classic work of fiction, we tried to recreate a classic video game? What if instead of a piece of metafiction, we made a meta game? Following the methods of artists like Rhonda Roland Shear, but also Richard Hamilton, Sherry Levine, and Duchamp himself, today we want to talk about the philosophical and technical aspects of remaking video games through a Let's Play of Triforce, a short puzzle game we made to explore the strange spaces and paradoxical places from Nintendo's original Legend of Zelda, developed by Shigeru Miyamoto's infamous R&D 4 team and released for the Famicom Disk System in 1986.
Triforce was originally published as a demo alongside a chapter on anamorphic games and metagaming, a book we wrote about how people play in, on, around, and through video games. A little over a year later, we expanded the demo into a standalone release on itch.io, where you can download it for free. What we want to talk about today is the Menardist methodology that we use to make Triforce, and the types of discoveries we encounter when undertaking the quixotic task of trying to recreate a classic game. In past projects, I've deployed Shear's embarrassingly simple and direct approach to art historical research by attempting to recreate Mary Flanagan's Giant Joystick, John Simon's Every Icon, and Cory Arcangel's Super Mario Clouds, among other projects. And each time I'm surprised to discover new details, like an embedded Jack-specific controller in the Giant Joystick, a miscalculated calendar in the web version of Every Icon, and a stubborn coin that Cory Arcangel couldn't have erased. Although these discoveries may seem idiosyncratic or trivial, the process of recreating each piece only deepened my appreciation for the original works, and playfully compounded their meaning. These projects got better and weirder the more we found out about them, And in the case of Triforce, we wanted to know more about Zelda and the 3D topologies hidden within Hyrule.
So this is Triforce, conference mode. And just to be clear, this is a special version of the game that we programmed for this talk. It has a slideshow interface, it has behind-the-scenes views, and other secrets. So let's get started. When I was little, I thought she could fly. The girl in the green dress could float, fall, and fly in 4 directions. I thought, she must be a lot lighter than Mario. Yeah, I just didn't know any better.
Speaking of Zelda, do you want to play? Okay, let's go.
So, Triforce begins by carefully recreating the original Legend of Zelda in the Unity game engine. From the title screen to the opening scene to "It's dangerous to go alone, take this." And in the spirit of Minardism, to make Triforce, we worked hard to count pixels and frames in order to approximate not only the graphics and sound of The Legend of Zelda, but also the movement, combat, and collecting. So here we mirror some of Nathan Altice's methods from his book I Am Error, employing the FCUX emulator to peek under the hood and parse Zelda's processes, counting animation frames, transition times, movement velocities, and so on. But it's important to remember that this is a recreation, not an emulation. Clearly, this isn't a work of assembly programming operating within the limits of the Nintendo Entertainment System's PPU and APU. Like Brendan Keogh's recreation of Snake and Breakout with Pico 8, or Pip and Bar's recreation of Snake and Breakout and Snake Out with Phaser, or even Nintendo's own remake of The Legend of Zelda during the production of Breath of the Wild, differences between the original and the recreation mark changes in the way we design games and the way we play games. Through these differences, we start to see another game altogether, a game of spheres, cubes, and pyramids, of toroids, Mobius strips, and climb bottles. So while working in a 3D engine, we started to think of the ways that Zelda was already a 3D game, how it was a platform for thinking about perspective.
In the original Legend of Zelda, there are several puzzling places hidden around Hyrule that defy the logic of the Cartesian grid, namely the Lost Woods, the Lost Hills, and the Lost Roads. When navigating these 2D mazes, Link finds himself endlessly looping, temporarily suspended by a classic gaming trope, where when you go off one edge of the screen, you reappear on the other side, like in Asteroids or Pac-Man. This process is actually more complex than it seems. There's a topological transformation occurring at the level of process, not graphics or layout. Although Hyrule seems flat, as Altice writes, looping spaces like the Lost Woods, Lost Hills, and Lost Roads produce, quote, unmappable cartographies that can only be represented through movement vectors, unquote. So in order to explore these spaces, we began by building a facsimile of the original game in Unity, and then used it to visualize the game's navigational puzzles in 3D. Once wrapped around donuts, cylinders, and spheres, these labyrinths not only look different, but they also produce different embodied effects. As we go forward, just remember to walk up, 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 up the mountain ahead.
Although the torus is rendered in 3D and suspended in the clouds with Hyrule floating far below, it's important to remember that the shape corresponds to the original Lost Hills puzzle, and so it can be solved the same way. Walking up, 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 up the mountain in the original game transforms into threading Link through a donut hole. These two representations of the Lost Hills are topologically homologous, even though they might look different to the player. So when you finally solve the puzzle, you can move from the overworld to the underworld. Inside the dungeons, we start to explore other shapes like the cylinder. Although Eastmost Peninsula holds the secret in the original level, this type of procedural shape was never used, though it could have been. Each new dungeon ends with a final room that holds a piece of the Triforce, but shrouds their shape in darkness and constrains rotation. These mysterious spaces smear Link in unnerving ways, and have trapped more than one YouTuber. Like an anamorphic image rotates the picture plane away from the drawing surface, Link no longer seems bound by a grid. Considering the long history of perspective and the way alternative visual regimes like anamorphosis put pressure on the concept of a stable, rational, enlightenment subject position, these designs echo art like Holbein's famous anamorphic memento mori in The Ambassadors, with its stretched skull drawing the gaze from a non-normative angle, as well as Mark Hansen's discussion of Robert Lazarini's stretched skulls, a non-perspectival sculpture that never quite resolves to the eye. So given that these examples not only challenge perspectival rendering, but ultimately challenged the ways that technical media address the body. In Triforce, we explored how both perspectival vision and video game play are always contingent on specific bodies, in specific places, at specific times, even as they traffic in this fantasy of a default universal subject. And if you're interested in this, we talk more about perspective and anamorphosis in Chapter 2 of Metagaming.
Speaking of metagaming, you may have noticed text punctuates Triforce. After the recovery of each Triforce piece, a short dialogue occurs. As you saw at the start, these discussions are designed around 3 speakers. Z, for example, represents Princess Zelda, the Triforce of Wisdom, and is personified as a didactic and excited student working through media philosophy. When I was a child, I always thought north was the way I was facing.
What's that?
A quote that your story about Zelda as a side-scroller reminded me of.
Huh, I like that. It makes me think of another childhood Zelda story.
Oh, it's from a book by Vivian Sobchak that begins with 3 parables about being lost in space. She writes about the non-Cartesian hyperbolic ways children navigate space. Before learning to tell left from right or internalizing the cardinal directions, there are other ways to map the world. A horizon in the distance, a structure standing alone, a point of light through the trees, breadcrumbs on a path.
Do you think there are other ways to map video games?
Definitely. The original Legend of Zelda used spaces like the Lost Woods, Lost Hills, and Lost Roads as navigational puzzles. And like Colossal Cave Adventure or Adventure on the 2600, these puzzles also produce unique bodily experiences.
What bodily experiences?
When the processes of a computer depart from the ways we process the world, the dissonance can be registered as a sick sensation. In New Philosophy for New Media, Mark Hansen calls the discontinuity between our senses and the speed and scale of technical media a digital any space whatever.
A digital any space whatever?
Digital ASW for short.
Ugh, whatever.
I think remapping the topology of these strange spaces to 3D frames the ways that even old games like The Legend of Zelda fail to resolve with our expectations, assumptions, and experiences of video games. I think Zelda is full of digital ASWs. So, we won't read the rest of this text, but G operates as an allegory for Ganon, the Triforce of Power, and shares a series of childhood memories and personal anecdotes, from stories about how Stephanie and I used to play this game as kids to my mom's morning sickness that's still triggered by Zelda music. G focuses on private histories and embodied experiences of play. Finally, L stands for Link, the Triforce of Courage, and is a cipher from the player and remains silent, like in every Legend of Zelda game. So, L focuses on the formal manipulation of dialogue. From playground word games to twisty little passages all alike, these segments are about the playability of text, looping, repeating labyrinths made of words.
Aside from the looping spaces in the original Legend of Zelda, there's another way to loop the game. Specifically, there are 2 systems that players can exploit to loop every screen. First, the process by which Link's smooth single-pixel movement gravitates toward an underlying 8x8 pixel grid when he changes directions in order to avoid getting snagged on rocks or blocks. And second, the single-pixel collision detection routine that's responsible for scrolling the screen to the next location on the map. So, the emergent result of the confluence of these 2 systems is that if Link is positioned exactly 5 pixels away from the pixel responsible for scrolling the screen, and then receives a single frame of input from a direction perpendicular to his current orientation, something unexpected happens in the original game. Link will move toward the subgrid, bypassing the single pixel collider and allowing the hero to continue forward without triggering a screen scroll. So upon wandering off the right side of the screen, Link will then wrap from one side of the level to the other as his horizontal position rolls over from 255 to 0. It looks really cool, and speedrunners use this exploit a lot to cross screens, walk through walls, and even loop from one side of the world to the other. So every screen is a donut, and the whole of Hyrule can be imagined as a torus.
Considering the idiosyncrasies speedrunners explore in the original software, in metagaming we argue, quote, beyond intended mechanics, the incredible speed and enormous scale of digital media guarantees the emergence of exploits, recombinatory rules operating outside both the experience of any one player and even the expectation of the game's original programmers. And if video games are agnostic to how they're played, and every operation yields states of equal value, then there are no glitches, nothing is out of bounds, and the intentions of an author and audience are arbitrary. In Triforce, we work with the infelicities of the Unity game engine rather than hide them. There's a lot of loose threads, and the seams of the software are on full display here. Like the secrets that emerge from exploits in the original Legend of Zelda, there are other ways to loop our game.
Considering that we began this talk with Rhonda Roland Shear and Stephen Jay Gould dropping threads, once the entire apartment is covered in string, what do? Throughout this process, there were historical, technical, and philosophical lessons that we learned about game design, NES development, the Unity game engine, and the Legend of Zelda, specifically about how each platform handles details from controller input and video and audio output to graphics processing, memory manipulation, enemy AI, and even particular representations of 3D space and looping. Even though computers are pretty efficient at copying and pasting digital data, the flow of data is no different from the flow of the river that Heraclitus once stepped into. As Matt Kirschenbaum puts it in Mechanisms, quote, "No two physical things in the world are ever exactly alike. And so forensic materiality rests upon the principle of individualization. You can't just cut and paste Zelda into Unity, and no two Zeldas are the same. It may seem embarrassingly simple, but this Pierre Menardist methodology to try and recreate a game is useful in some really specific practical ways for researching games and teaching game design. Imagine teaching a Unity class devoted entirely to copying the movement and mechanics of classic games, the same way a painter would learn by copying a painting or a musician copying a composition. But as useful as this is as a method of research and discovery, by that same token, after unfolding the weird 3D world structuring how we play, or finding the sewn ends of Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages, we still haven't really solved any of these puzzles. In fact, Patrick and I would say that this method is better at producing questions than it is answers. Even in the case of mainstream entertainment media like video games, our embodied experience of technical media remains a smear of paint, or a snarl of string, a stretched skull, or skeletons circling a cylinder. We still don't know what Zelda does. ROM hackers, speedrunners, and even Nintendo employees are still learning new things about old games in 2020. And if any of you attempted a remake of Zelda, it would look really different from ours. The point isn't to recreate a smooth line, but to start dropping strings.
Thank you.